So there you have it, in listening mode and thinking, and you've heard now at ACFID conference from Minister Connie Favoranti-Wells, Penny Wong, and also Senator Richard Di Natale from the Australian Greens. So we don't know whether an election will happen in 18 months' time or in 18 days' time, but you've had a chance to hear and engage with the government and the opposition and the Greens around our development program and policy. So, and we do have the campaign very, very active. You heard the pitch from Sash and Matt last night that we need that fighting fund to help shore up resources to campaign up to the next election. So I'd really encourage you to join the campaign if you're not a member. It's really important to give that support, and also that program that is taking politicians out to developing countries to see NGO programs that Save the Children is running with Gates Foundation funding. I'm very pleased to say that they'll be running another trip to the Solomons in January, and Susan Pascoe will be joining on that trip. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the first panel of the day, who will be providing practical perspectives on how organisations can engage in transformational practice to achieve long-lasting and impactful change. So I'd invite our panellists to come up onto the stage, but chairing the panel is Associate Professor Chris Roche, Director of the Institute for Human and Social Change at the Trobe University, and they've been our partners this past year in a very innovative program called Making Change Happen that some of you and people from the sector have been participating in, looking at how you can work to get social, political and organisational change. Chris has over 25 years experience working with international NGOs before he joined La Trobe in 2012, and he's particularly interested in understanding how social change happens, who is involved, and how the effectiveness of attempts to promote change is assessed. And Chris is going to be joined by Liz Skelton. Does Liz wave? So Liz is Director and Co-founder for Collaboration for Impact, an organisation that builds capacity and collective impact, adaptive leadership for social change, systems change and social innovation. And we've also been working with ACFID and La Trobe with Collaboration for Impact this year on a variety of initiatives. So it's great to have you here, Liz. Alan Robbins. Alan is the co-founder and global head of partnerships at Devex. And Devex, ACFID Conference's 2017 media partner. Devex, of course, is well known to you all for its fantastic coverage of international aid and development issues, including here in Australia. And I think Lisa from Devex is here in the audience too. Somewhere, wave. So it's great to have you here, Alan. Devex have been a very important player in building global communication on aid and development issues. Steve McDonald, from the Director of the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership. Steve, also the Centre is our gold sponsor this year, so we're very appreciative of that. The Centre is a leading centre for teaching, research policy on development and innovation for the humanitarian sector, and it works not just with the humanitarian community in Australia, but reaches out into the region as well and does lots of training in the countries where agencies work. World Vision CEO Claire Rogers, an ACFID board member. Claire has been at the helm for just a year. Today. Congratulations on your anniversary. And she was formerly head of digital banking for ANZ Australia. And Lynffer WiniMaltungtung from the Solomon Islands Family Support Centre. It's a great honour to have you here. Thank you for coming all this way. The Solomon Islands Family Support Centre is an organisation which runs preventative and response services for women experiencing family violence. So please welcome our panel, and over to you, Chris, to get that underway.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Penny, Wong. So, just to get our heads back into the right space. Yesterday, we started with an inspirational presentation from Olivia Tharpa, which got us going got me thinking about really where change happens, how it happens, and who drives change. We then had really interesting discussion about social movements, and social movements historically have always driven change at a kind of systemic level. We then had a few polys and that, I won't go into much of that. And we had some lightning talks at the end, which delved into issues of our context and issues around big data and the rest of it. And we're now getting to the question of, right, well, we've got social movements that make change happen. We've got NGOs and a collapsing aid budget, and polys promising that they can't do much about it in the short term, at least. So what do we do? And I'm going to quote from the great Duncan Green. When he wrote recently about NGO discussions about the future. And he wrote the following: everything is changing. Mobile phones, rise of China, disintermediation. Everything is speeding up. Interwebs, instant feedback, fickle consumers. You, NGOs, in contrast, are excruciatingly slow, bureaucratic, out of touch. I spit on you and your log frames. The conclusions then flounder about in the latest development jargon: resilience, leverage, disruption, transformation, innovation, add, delete, combine as you see fit, and then urge us all to transform or die. Then we all go home. So the advantage is we're not going home yet, and so this today is really about, so let's not just go home saying transform or die. Let's get a bit further than that this time. So we've got all day to do that, and what better way to do that than starting off the panel? And so the other, who has read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Whoa! Hi, guys. Who's ever read his second book, which was called Lila? Yay! So, what was really interesting about Lila was an examination in particularly of North America, what could be learned from North American indigenous communities. And I think last night we learned a lot about what we could learn about deliberative democracy from Megan Davis. But in that book, Persig talked about the difference between static quality, which was really about the values, the ethics, the morality we hold, and dynamic quality, which is new ideas. And unless we have a strong ethical and values based, we can't judge any new idea. We just accept anything. So what I really want our panelists to do today is to help us, yes, explore the new ideas, but what are the ethical and moral bases upon which we should judge them as well? Sorry, I should have warned you about that, shouldn't I? So, and I'm going to therefore start with you, Alan, because basically I hear you dropped out of grad school to help set up Devex, which that impresses me. But I'm really interested in the social enterprise nature of Devex, because certainly in the Making Change Happen course, a lot of NGOs there were saying, actually, we've got a funding crisis. Some saying our business model is broken. We can't rely on government funding, clearly. And a lot of the government funding doesn't allow us to support the kinds of processes we know actually make change happen. So there's a lot of interest is can social enterprise help unlock that and solve that problem?
Well, yeah, so first off, I did drop out of grad school, but I finished. So unlike a couple of my colleagues, so I'll just put that out there. But yeah, you know, we started in 2000. We're old now, and we were 25-year-old kids at the time. And, you know, for us, it was about not saying, you know, we're going to, you know, we are a social enterprise, but that wasn't our starting point. For us, it was more about, you know, how can we make change in this sector from by looking outside the sector. Okay, there was 99.9% of the world that was out there that was actually doing smart things. So what can we do to help bring some of those things into the development community? And we looked at things like, things we initially touched, they don't sound transformational. They sound, it's an evolution rather than transformation, right? We looked at funding, we looked at helping people find work in development. We looked at creating a community around this global development term and this global development work. So I think that's one of my big points, actually, which is, social enterprises are important, and they can be very important, but I don't think that we're going to see, I don't think it's the only thing. You were talking about this adjective, is about how people talk about NGOs. I actually think very highly of NGOs, even though I come from a non-NGO. And one of the main differences, though, is that if we're going to reach these SDGs, which hopefully we do, we just heard the senator talking about aid budgets. So, traditional, what I'll call in quotes, traditional aid players, the contractors, the NGOs, whoever they might be, the aid agencies, that's not going to get us there. So we do need organizations that can, and social enterprises, it's a definition where we actually don't even really know. I mean, there's some people that say a social enterprise can't make a financial profit. Or there's some that will say they have to be certified by some agency, or maybe it's actually a legal incorporation. But generally speaking, it's organizations that have social missions, social returns that are maybe instead of, or maybe even in addition to the financial returns, and they are looking at, they're customer-oriented. So they're not, one difference between the traditional players and those is the customer is also the user. So if you look at a traditional NGO, which I highly respect, the customer is often not the user. The customer is often the agency or the funder. So I think that's one big part. And then another big part, which is a big distinction between the traditional aid sector and sort of social enterprises and the new model, is these new models, is that this idea of failure. And there's a lot of talk from Silicon Valley and others about you're not an entrepreneur unless you start at 99 companies and failed, and then your 100th one succeeds. That's a great model. It's interesting. We should be bringing it into development, but it's not a model that DFAT or USAID or the traditional players can use. So I don't think it's I don't think it's social enterprises are the solution. I think they're part of the solution. And I think that the traditional players are also part of the solution. So anyway, I'll leave it with that for now.
That's great. Thank you. Claire, we heard a little bit about big data last night, and you've clearly got a lot of experience in the space of digitalization. Last night I did remember the book that Cathy O'Neill has written recently called Weapons of Math Destruction, Why Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. So what's your take on that in your role now about how you balance out the power that comes with big data and the accountability that those that are using big data need to exhibit?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think if I could just make a first comment about the social enterprise element here, what we're doing by doing things like social enterprise is getting into the spend part of consumers' wallets, if you like, or businesses' wallets. And so that opens up a whole new opportunity. The other side where I think we need to be transforming is to get into the capital markets. How can we use capital to build and create greater impact out in the countries where we need to deliver on the sustainable development goals? So I think one of the transformations we need to make as an industry is not just thinking about the traditional donor or gifting of hard cash, and think about how can we get into the flow of a spend pathway, or how do we get into the flow of a capital pathway? So that's one of the ways I think the sector needs to transform. But to come back to your question around data, look, I think there's a lot of complexity in the ethical elements of data, and I probably don't want to tackle that today, other than to say security is absolutely paramount. And one of our highest priorities is child protection, and data in the process of sharing and connecting donors with the field, that data can become really important for the security of the child. So absolutely put lots and lots of locks and keys around that information. But if you talk about the use of data in the donor experience, and I think this is where the sector can learn from other industries who've really grappled with this, your donors are telling you lots of stuff that you need to respond to by the way they are already engaging with your organisation. And my example comes from banking, not surprisingly. And when we started to look at the transformation we needed to make in our sales experiences, one very simple thing we looked at was how many people were trying to access ANZ to buy something from a mobile. And I know that's not new news for you, but have a look, if you haven't yet, have a look at how many people are pinching and zooming to get onto your website to connect with you. And when we took that friction out of the experience, that was just simple data. You don't need complex AI here, simple data. We had a significant uptake in sales just by removing that very small piece of friction. And so I think one of the things I talk to my team about all the time is go and experience what we're asking our donors to experience and get rid of all that friction, because you can see it when you actually go through the experience. And I don't think enough of corporate Australia actually do this either. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to transform around the digital experience, which our donors are telling us quite loudly and clearly that that's the way they want to engage with us. It also has this other lovely power, which is that you can bring the field or the work that we do up very close and personal in a very current way, very instantaneous way that our traditional ways of communicating with donors don't do.
Thanks, Claire. Stephen, so we might have a social enterprise, we might digitalise, we might get more money as NGOs, and yet my understanding is that recent research suggests just 2% of humanitarian aid gets to local organisations. You have looked at this question through the prism of humanitarian work and leadership. So what's that all about?
Well, I think one of the real challenges we've got is that we are approaching, I think, 18 months since the World Humanitarian Summit. A whole range of commitments around localisation, a range of commitments around improving leadership. And on the one hand, we're saying that, well, 25% of the financing is going to go to local actors. We haven't actually really defined what we mean by that either. If you look at organisations like World Vision, you've nationalised the majority of your country officers. You could claim to be as local as Mercy Malaysia or any other national or local agency. But what we're starting to see now is a real obsession with finance, and yes, we need to move towards much more direct financing of local organisations. But what we're not hearing in the conversation is how do we also shift the locus of control? How do we shift the power and the decision-making and the autonomy from agencies that are represented in this room, from donors such as DFAT or DFID or USAID, to one where the decision-making and the autonomy and the ownership is as close to the affected community as possible. And there's a couple of reasons, I think, for that. One is that we don't really understand as well as we should how to do that. We still conceptualize partnerships in a very transactional way. It's about I'm transacting with partner X or this part of my organization to deliver essentially a service on behalf of either myself or my donor. Yeah? And we actually need to shift our thinking about how we conceive partnerships if we're going to realise that localisation agenda. And we have to move beyond broad metrics about 25% of the finance. Well, let's place the decision. It doesn't matter as much where the money is located. What matters is who's in control of the decision on how to use that money. And we need to, that's where the real power lies. Everything else is transactions. The other thing I think that is a real challenge, and whilst we've seen some change and some transformation occur within the humanitarian system and more broadly within the development sector, there is a real risk aversion, and in order to create change and to have change, you need a combination of an appetite for risk and a willingness to challenge ourselves, our own assumptions. But you also need leadership, and it's not just leadership at the individual level, but it's also organisational and systemic leadership that's required as well. There's 130 different member organisations within ACFID. What is the collective leadership position of those organisations around any given topic? And there'll be 130 different views. There is a need to rethink as well our connectedness back to our ethics and values. And if you come back to issues such as data, so I think, Claire, you're sort of looking at very much how do we engage with our supporters and those that provide resources to enable all of us to do our work. But I've also seen a trend when we talk about big data. How does that link back to localisation? I was talking to someone from UNICEF a couple of months ago, and they were talking about this fabulous algorithm that they were developing that was going to analyse social media tweets and Facebook posts and probably MySpace posts if that still exists and all these kinds of things. But they were talking about how they use that to inform their decision-making at an executive level. They weren't actually talking about how do you take issues such as data and use that to enable communities to make better decisions about the challenges that they face, whether that be in humanitarian or development, which does link back to the ethics of how we use data, how we collect data, and how we conceive of the basic protection principles that sit around that.
Thank you. So, Lynffer, you've heard and listened to a lot of chatter around transformation and disruption and change. You gave a fabulous talk yesterday about the work on Family Support Centre. I was privileged when I was at Oxfam to visit Family Support Centre back in a while back. I'm not saying how long. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and how you are partners, how your partners work with you, and what they could be doing differently, how they could transform themselves in ways that would help your work?
Thank you. Firstly, Family Support Centre is a local NGO in the Solomon Islands. It has been registered in 1995 to provide services for victims and survivors of violence. We have an alarming rate of violence, as many of you have known. Our study, the Family Health and Safety Study, has indicated that 64% of women living in Solomon Islands are facing violence, and that is 2 in every 3 women that are likely to face violence by their intimate partner. So our services provide counseling, legal services, and we have just introduced case management into our services. We are part of a referral network that is formally formed under the government. We have 5 service providers that signed an MOU in 2013 under the referral network to have a coordinated referral network between the service providers. So some of them, the 5 members are the police, Ministry of Health, which includes the National Referral Hospitals that we have, our clinics, and the Social Welfare Division that it sits under the Ministry of Health. We also have the Ministry of Justice through the Public Solicitor's Office that provides legal assistance, and 2 NGOs, that is Family Support Centre, which we provide counseling and legal assistance, and also Christian Care Centre, which is our only safe home. It is a Christian NGO that is made up of sisters from the Anglican Church, and for FSC, we are a secular NGO. Now, the challenges that we face in that safe net was clients were falling out of the system, so we introduced the case management system into our services, and the hub sits within the Family Support Center. Now, FSC is highly dependent on donor, FSC, I mean Family Support Center, highly dependent on donor funding. We have over the years been having big support, and Australian government has given a lot of support through organization, international NGOs that are living in Solomon Islands, that are working in Solomon Islands. We have a long partnership with Oxfam through the Standing Together Against Violence program. We also have some support from the police that the DFAT has given through the police and through the Ramsey assistance and things like that. And also currently in 2016 until now, we have DFAT providing funding through the International Women's Development Agency that helped us. Now, Family Support Center services have, like I said, we started in 1995. Our services were centered mostly in Honiara, that is our capital, but we have 9 provinces and 80% of the population live in the provinces. And it has been a big struggle to get support or funding. With limited funding, we can only provide our services within Honiara. It was only until 2016 with the support that DFAT has given to IWDA through the ANCP funding, we were able to expand into the provinces, and through a funding through the British High Commission in the Solomon Islands, we were able to expand to 5 provinces, training volunteers, village people that are living in the provinces, training them, and they form a committee to provide basic counseling and awareness workshops to raise awareness on violence against women and girls. This year, we have managed through the IWDA funding to, through UN Trust Fund, through the UN Women, we were able to expand to another 2 provinces. So far we've expanded to 7 provinces, and there are 9 provinces that we have. So we have only 2 more provinces, but that is only 1 committee in a province, and our geographical layout makes access being difficult for us. So even if we have committees within the provinces, the access to get to that committee for remote places is a bit of a difficulty. And I guess that is where I would respond to you. I would like to see changes in terms of not only financial increase of financial support from our development partners, but also from our government. We have just a little bit of grant from the government to help us, to help struggling NGOs like us, and also service providers that are within the SafeNet, to expand into the provinces, to increase our support in order for us to improve in our service delivery. And we've also, in terms of that, UN Women, the UN Joint Program under the Essential Service Package initiative, that is, the main donor is the Australian government, and thank you for that. We've aligned our work to the essential services for social services, and those are the things that, for me, for a big change for Solomon Island is to enable service providers like us to expand into the provinces, to address the issue of this alarming rate of violence that is happening. And like I've already said, 80% of the people live in the provinces, and that is what I would like to see.
Thank you. Can I just follow up with one question? Because yesterday, when you were presenting, you had a list of donors that give you money. Would it be better if you just had one donor giving you the same amount of money, rather than 6 or 7 giving you what you get now? Would that be risky in the sense that you would then only have one donor, and if they were bad news, that would be a problem? But on the other hand, having 6 donors, 6 visits, 6 sets of reporting, is that a pain?
Both ways, I think it's challenging. Having one donor, we've had some experience being dependent highly on one donor. We had a previous experience that we faced when that donor stopped giving money to us. I mean, the program ended, and we had we were at the risk of closing our doors, but then during that time, I thought that staff were going to leave, but we had to make some fast decisions. Our board sat down and said the last resort would be to lay off staff. And the staff came together and we met and we decided to go on half pay to just make sure that we run and look for money. And we were able, that experience happened in 2016. And luckily enough, we were able to get funding from IWDA who came in and helped us throughout the time, and also some leftover money from our previous donors that they were able to make decision to divert the fundings, not to implement the activities that were under the program, but to divert it to our operational costs. So I guess having one donor would be quite risky for us because we've been through that experience. It wasn't a good experience for us. However, it made us strong that we were able to get other funding. And I guess now in our strategic plan is that for us to diversify funding, to have more than one funding, not to depend on just one donor, but to diversify funding. And that's why we had the 6 donors that are funding our organization at the moment. But I guess the risk I'm saying in terms of having other donors, there's a lot of reporting to do. There's a lot of different type of reporting that you have to do, acquittals of funding and things like that. So it consumes most of our time in terms of that. So that's the risk that I...
Okay, thank you. So Liz, you were part of the 3rd unit of the Making Change Happen course. You experienced firsthand the kind of challenges that the sector is facing. Your reflections on that challenge and the leadership question, which Stephen's also alluded to.
So that's a pretty broad question, and particularly after I'm just reflecting on the insights that I've heard from everybody. I'm struck by the similarity between the dynamics in this sector and probably all the other sectors that we engage in. So Collaboration for Impact is really looking at how do we try and address the fundamental conditions that lead to the issues that we're trying to address, the complex issues. So everything that you've talked about, the leadership work around how do we transform our cultures and ways of working from ones which are potentially working in a transactional way with old funding models, heavily reliant on government, to ones which are co-creating both the framing of what the problems are and the solutions with the people who are affected by it at the time. And I guess what I've heard from everybody on the panel is that to do that requires that level of challenging the current norms which are there, being able to have cultures where it is safe to fail. And, you know, I heard, Stephen, you said that's not possible no, sorry, it was you, Alan, that said, you know, that's not possible, the same kind of test and try approach that's in the tech sector. But I guess, you know, what I'd say is for the complexity that we're facing, in a way, unless we do that, the costs are much, much higher. And Stephen, you spoke to really, you know, that requires that shift from being fairly risk averse to being able to try small experiments, which that was a great example of, you know, doing very small tests in some areas which are contained, the risks are contained, but having a go, and in that there's going to be disruption. And I think, you know, what I've heard from what Linda's brought in is the impact of what happens when, you know, we're very busy grappling with what these issues are as larger organizations, but the impact on the ground, it's mirrored, is being able, having individual programmatic responses, spending a lot of time having to basically survive rather than being able to address those systemic issues. So my observation underneath all of this is that what we are fundamentally talking about when we're talking about transformation is how do we prepare this whole sector for not just the opportunity, of the transformation, but the loss that's involved. And I very rarely hear that being talked about when we're talking about transformation, change. Everyone's like, yes, we need it. But actually, the reason that it doesn't happen and the reason that most change initiatives are failing is because it's the fear of what do we have to lose and give up as we go along. Because implicitly, the systems that are there in place are set up to maintain status quo. So unless we've got ways of working, we've got cultures, and we've got that leadership at the top, and actually at all levels, not just at the top, which is able to look at what current ways of work are no longer working for us, but actually realizing what we're doing is having to prepare the whole sector for some form of loss. Now, depending on where you sit, the higher up you are, or if you're at the edges of your organization, you're going to feel that more acutely. And the people who stand to lose the most, or fear, and it's usually fearing they stand to lose the most, will often resist that change. So the question about leadership for me is, how are we equipping our organizations to have these conversations about, so what do we stop doing? Where do we have to shift so that we can align? And I think, I'm going to move from that's the conflictual view around that this is actually all about loss and we will resist it. And systems are ruthless recruiters of status quo. They will keep on pulling you back to the way that things are always done. So the other side of this, the shadow side, I guess, is the opportunity of the time that we're in, which is the potential for alignment. There's now clearly compelling reasons why the sector, there is a level of urgency. When the system's under threat, that's when there's actually potentially a moment to be able to bring people together. And I guess what I've heard across the board is, we've seen it yesterday, and the decisions that came out from this conference about collaborating to advocate around the potential loss of advocacy and potential loss of being able to get external funding. So there's lots of examples of where, as a sector, you've collaborated to get those early wins. I guess the question is there now appetite and readiness to collaborate to actually address the systemic challenges? And really, and I guess this is being mirrored in every context that we're working in, is that there's actually not the resources any longer or the appetite to keep on having multiple programmatic responses, which ultimately may not be doing anything to change the conditions on the ground. So I guess what I'm seeing, the opportunity, and what I'm hearing is that how can we think about both? How do we sustain the programs that are working, and we know that they're having great impact for a specific population group, and how do we then leverage and align what we're doing, what our funding is, how we're engaging on the ground to be able to leverage the collective power that's in the room to get the system change.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was a great analysis of the discussion. Maybe you should be chairing.
You're doing a great job.
Claire, how are you avoiding this ruthless conscription of the status quo?
Yeah, I'm encouraged by your observation, Liz, that we do have to work really hard not to maintain the status quo. And I've talked a lot about digital in the donor experience, but we know that for every 10 people that join the internet, one will will start a business and one will get a job. And so I would say that our programming approaches are still very face-to-face, very manual, and this transformation will happen around us whether we like it or not, but the opportunity to bring digital into how we do our programming to increase scale and increase access to information, because ultimately that's what changes people's perspectives and empowers people to actually get on with the job of transforming communities. And I'm not saying that we're there, but I'm saying let's and I'm not saying all development contexts have access to digital, but let's start looking at how we can use digital to really increase scale and impact and drive that empowering leadership where it's not us with the information imparting, to come back to your point, Stephen, around partnership and what makes good partnership, but it's the sharing and enabling of that access to information. I think digital's got a really key role to play in that.
So, Alan, if I can come back to you, one of the, well, some commentators are suggesting that in part of the problem with the whole sector is the narrative. The narrative is patronizing, it's neo-colonial, it's raise money over here to send over there to make them more like us, rather than a lot of the stuff we heard at the social movement panel, which is about common challenges, common global problems, and how we collectively confront those. And I'm just thinking from your perspective in the communication side of the business, where you're seeing the kind of narrative going and what could be changing, what could be transformatory about a changed narrative?
Well, yeah, really interesting question. And so first off, I think that we are seeing it move more toward human-centered design and the consumer being the recipient being the client, basically. And you see that a lot with the social enterprise. You see it a lot with the aid agencies as well. And most of them do have small groups that are doing sort of working on kind of demand-based development, and so I know DFAT's done some innovation work, and I know USAID does, and a lot of them have development financing institutions, which are more about the CDC and DFID. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you hear that, and you hear, I think that it is paternalistic, or whatever you might call it, at the same time, it's hard to ask, when you talk about the ODA, right, when you talk about the governments, it's really hard to ask them not to put some constraints on it. Now, if it's a US or Australia, they might be values-based constraints. You can't be corrupt, you can't do these things, and if it's other countries like maybe China, maybe it's financial-based constraints, like we need to have, you need to use Chinese laborers to do this, or something like that. It's really hard to say in today's political environment that the governments can't do that. So my view is that we need to bring in players that can do that, and bring in people from other industries, bring in private sector organizations, bring in different types of NGOs, have NGOs that are on this stage and in this room also evolving and transforming. So that yes, they're doing the traditional programming, which does come with constraints, but they can also do other programming that might not come with those constraints. So yeah, I don't see a short-term, at least, shift in that narrative. I think it's going to continue to happen, and might maybe even happen more. Because you're seeing a lot of tying of aid to security and national security and things like that. So I just think that, yeah, it's more about bringing in other players that might not have such strings attached.
Stephen, the narrative for humanitarian action and post the Humanitarian Summit, where do you see that going? And particularly when we look at Myanmar at the moment, we look at Manus, we look at Indigenous Australia. We still talk about humanitarian action as if it's, again, that's something distant, it's over there. Is the narrative changing there?
I think the narrative certainly amongst the humanitarian practitioners is starting to shift quite markedly. And people have been doing quite a lot of reflection actually on how do I as an individual practitioner change what I'm doing. I think what's missing, and we had our first conference earlier this year, and there were a couple of CEOs there, and we asked them this question, which was, at the executive level or at the board level, is the conversation about localisation happening? And the answer was no, it's not really happening. It's not happening amongst the, at the top level of the federated families. I suspect that a lot of the smaller agencies are already thinking about it because they're already operating very much in that way. But there is also a challenge to the humanitarian narrative overall from other actors that are looking at the lack of agility that we display and saying, well, we're going to step into that space. So on the one hand, you've got a very, very local approach where Even if you go back to sort of 2011, Mekong floods, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and I was in Bangkok, and what we saw was that whilst I was there with Save the Children, and we're working with CARE and World Vision and Oxfam and others on sort of trying to sort of self-coordinate some kind of meaningful response. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that local businesses, informal humanitarian actors, and local organisations were using social media in a way that we hadn't really noticed before, which was, we need X at this evacuation centre. And within 5 or 10 minutes, so-and-so, the regional manager for Tesco Lotus, said, right, we've just dispatched a truck, they've got all the supplies you need. Meanwhile, we're sitting around the table thinking, right, how do we make sure we get our hands on the supplies in order to send them to location X? So at that very local level, there's almost a kind of, I suppose, democratisation of humanitarian assistance going on. Then on the other hand, we have organisations that are emerging, such as Team Rubicon. Now, my understanding is they're not an ACFID member, they have no intention of becoming an ACFID member. They look at organisations like the ones in the room and they think, you guys are kind of slow and sclerotic and we're just going to get out there and do things. But what they're also doing at the same time is reinforcing a very traditional narrative, which is deploy lots of expatriates into the field to do stuff for people. And so unless we actually demonstrate a different way of working, collectively and as individual organisations, then we're going to end up in this kind of cyclical approach of, well, here's the traditional way of doing things, Team Rubicon's turned up, this is how they do it, they don't even, they're not even bought into things like sphere standards and so on. So there are two things that are happening. We've got to engage at the very, very micro level, and we've also got to look at who these emerging actors are that are appearing.
Thanks. Now, Lynffer, the other thing that Family Support Centre has done and been engaged with others is changes to policy. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's getting to not just, you're doing the work with the survivors of violence, but you're also working on the policy level as well. Can you explain a bit about that? Because I think it's important, because the degree to which outside agencies are supporting not just service delivery, but also changing policy and practice is an area that I would really value your thoughts on.
Okay, I guess, well, in the Solomon Islands, we the NGOs or the service providers have worked closely with our government in terms of pushing forward the changes that we wanted in terms of changing the policy, changing the legislations and things like that. We were able to, Family Support Center were able to have support from our donor partners in training us in terms of lobbying the government, in terms of doing campaign planning and things like that. And Family Support Center has worked a lot in collaboration with our SafeNet partners. Say, for example, we had this Family Protection Act that we wanted to put into the parliament that has been going through the journey of 10 years. People were talking about having a law that addresses safety and protection for the victims and survivors of violence. So FSC was able to to be part of the legislative working group that was working on working with a consultant to draft the bill at that time. We were able to also work with the legislative working group to campaign and to lobby ministers when the bill was sent into the cabinet and the parliament for debate. We were able to work closely with the legislative committee that was under the Ministry of Women at that time. We were able to help the legislative committee to lobby 5 ministers, having our community educator who is a male, plus our volunteers that we have trained through our program to lobby the minister to explain the importance of having the bill going forward, our experience, our data in terms of the statistics that we have. Say for example, like Family Support Center, we have an average of 300 new clients each year that we supported, and that has increased last year because of our reach into the provinces. But when we lobbied for that bill, it was in 2014 when we hadn't expanded into the province, but we used our experience going into the province, doing awareness and things like that. So we were able to be part of that. We were able to appear before the legislative committee that was in the cabinet to lobby for the bill as well, and having that done, the bill was able to be passed in Parliament, and now we have the Family Protection Act. But we also have inputs into our policies, like we have a good policy that is the gender equality and women's development policy, and we have a subsidiary policy under the good, that is the ending violence against women policy that has a number of recommendations that we have inputs in. So working closely with the government is something that we have put as priority.
Thanks. And Liz, I mean, that's a really good example of a kind of reform coalition that has worked for many years to build a coalition that has done very smart politics in terms of getting that bill through. That form of collaboration and the questions about loss and how you manage this systemic change and practical process. The title of this session, when Mark introduced it, was so practical tips. So you got some practical tips to help end on.
Right. Okay. Practical tips. As I was listening to everybody, what stuff was playing out in my head was maybe the practical tips will be a story around a community that we've started to see this type of way of working happening. There's a few things that people have just talked about, which is around pretty much how do we think about shifting power? And I want to just pick up on what Stephen said there, that thinking about starting with purpose, the why are we here and what are we trying to do question, I think is really core at the bottom of all of this, because that's when we see that there's many other actors and players out there who actually have got the same purpose as us, who are trying to work towards alleviating poverty or whatever it might be. And being able to align around purpose actually gives you great leverage then in figuring out together what the how and the what is. But I would say that's one of the things that in any collaborative initiative partnership we skip past really quickly. And one of the reasons I've seen we skip past it is that we get into a space where it's aspirational. It becomes about the values and ethics that you kicked off the session with. And there's a discomfort around that, around can we actually achieve that? Is it attainable? But I think the type of tensions which are now playing out where you've got those ethics and values and the social good, if you like, competing around market forces. And who will be the custodian of those values and ethics if it's not this sector? Who's going to be holding that narrative? So that narrative comes out of the conversation about purpose, the why are we here, which is really the only anchor you've then got to then start to work with. So what do we do and how do we do it? Because that's where that going into a really messy space of being able to create, come up with different ideas, test and try, figure out what worked, what didn't, will happen. But the only real measure we can be looking at is, are we actually making progress against that shared purpose? And I think core to that, a practical tip, and the example I'd give would be a community in New South Wales. It's in a different context, but I think there's a lot of relevance. Burke in regional New South Wales, who are 4 years into an initiative of basically the community coming up with framing the problems themselves and coming up with the solutions, supported by NGOs and supported by government at federal, state, local level, and a whole range, and business and philanthropy as well. But the initiatives are led by the elders in the community who basically got sick of the young people in the community on a fast track to the prison down the road. And this is a great example of where the answers lie in the community. But they basically said to government and NGOs is, we don't want any more money. We're awash with funding. We've got so much money in it. Funding is not the issue. The issue is that everybody is working in silos around us and we're not addressing the issues, and we want to take time to figure it out. And that was really disarming for NGOs, for government, because they didn't know what their role was. And there was a complete shift in power, but they stayed at the table and continued working with them. And really what was being asked by the community is, we want to work with you, but we want you to use your power and influence differently. We need your services on the ground, but we need you to show up and be in different partnerships where the power sits within here. So, I mean, what that's taken for the organizations who've been involved from a practical level is that they've had to really fundamentally look at their own purpose, their own why, the way that they've been looking at the services and going, we're not actually meeting the needs of the community, so we've got to take a bit of time to listen. Now, obviously, the reality is that they've still got to keep services operating while this is going on. So they've created a different space to go, we're going to go and do this exploration, a bit like Claire talked about, but the rest of the business still keeps operating. And we're going to try turning up in a different way. But it meant actually letting go of power and being willing to take up a different role, not have the answers, and stay in the game and be able to bring influence. Actually, that's what most of the people were doing, was bringing the power, the influence, the connections, the skills. So over time and over those 4 years, there's been culture shifts in those organizations, but it's been led from the top. It's not been allocated to a department within the organization to be the ones to the partnerships or community engagement area. It's actually been embedded and across the work, but they've had to embark on that agenda of change.
Brilliant, and thank you for that. And so that's it. There's tea time. I'd just like to say thank you to the panel. I think what you've done for us is help connect what we've heard yesterday around the role of social movements, the role of locally driven change and activism, and how that is how change happens, with the actually relatively modest role that outside supporters play. But it is an important role, and it can be and should be much more strategic, but it's a secondary role. And I think that is a very useful place to start, is being a little bit humbler about the role, but also that we can improve and get better. So I'd like to thank the panel, and would you please put your hands together?
Thank you so much, Chris, Lynffer, Steve, Liz and Alan and Claire. It's fantastic, stimulating discussion. It's triggered a thought, and we also have an action for you, but the thought is just coming off the theme of localisation. We had a workshop in Auckland earlier this year with Australian and New Zealand INGOs and their partners and their field staff, and after 2 days of talking, Pacific partners and field staff were able to name the issue of power and power imbalance as a major issue, but we weren't really able to unpack it. And for some of us it triggered, well, if the power imbalance sort of, is starting at the top and there's a disparity between the resources of Australian and New Zealand NGOs that have the funds that disperse, governance is very important. And if you look at Indigenous organisations in Australia, it's not tenable these days to have an Indigenous organisation run by non-Indigenous people. They're Aboriginal controlled. And similar in disability, we've seen a transformation at the governance level. And so, given the resources we have, given the communication ability we have, it just sort of triggers the question, at a governance level, should we have greater participation in a consistent, ongoing way with people from developing countries at a board level amongst the governance in Australia and NGOs doing development. So not just Australian development expertise, but actually that informed perspective from people in the South on our board. But I'll leave that with you. We do have an action. We moved a very strong resolution about the current humanitarian situation in Manus. People that have been arbitrarily detained for 4 years and are now in a standoff with the PNG and Australian authorities. And then last night we heard a speech of great grace, but also anger from Megan Davis from the Referendum Council about the perfunctory dismissal of one of the key recommendations of the Referendum Council around a voice to advise the Parliament. So what we would like to offer you the opportunity to do is we actually have numbers for the Prime Minister's office and the Leader of the Opposition at the foyer, at the registration desk, and also in a room upstairs, and a script which you can riff off. And if you would like to, or we'd really encourage you, everyone here, to actually make the effort to go and make a call in, get those numbers and make a call in to the Prime Minister's office and ask them to take action and support the recommendations of the Referendum Council. It was in the resolution that was passed yesterday, the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and also to say that the standoff and the mistreatment of asylum seekers and refugees in Manus must be brought to an end. Morning tea is now